Welcome to the third episode of our podcast. In this episode, I'm interviewing Veronica Agard. Veronica Agard is a poet, writer, aberrisha, community educator, and connector at the intersections of Black identity, wellness, representation, and culture. She curated the Who Heals the Healer series and the conference of the same name, and facilitates the Ancestors in Training educational project. I originally met Veronica when we were both attending City College, and I've had the honor of being friends with her since. Veronica's work to spread practices of joy and ancestral reverence has had a huge impact on my life. To follow Veronica's work, please check her out on her website, veronicaagard.com, and her Instagram, Ancestors in Training. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Thank you. So, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Where I wanted to start the conversation is, so for as long as I've known you, you've been a community builder. And over the course of about the 10 years that I've known you, you've built multiple communities and groups and circles. Some still exist to this day and some don't.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to what your experience, what has it been like for you in terms of like what's been your motivation behind community building, and what has the internal journey been through the creation and dissolving of these circles?
It's not like you started with a soft question.
No, ma'am.
So how do I start this? I feel like community building has been important to me because I'm an only child. So I've been, in the sense of like inner work and, only child stereotypes is that we're very selfish and that we're worried about ourselves. And I, for as long as I can remember, have always been the one that remembers birthdays and tries to make like little victories or little things, like bigger things, or more ceremonial. Some would call that nostalgic or a touch romantic, but it's just more so of understanding that our time is finite. So I think for me, especially when I moved to the city, when I went to college, I think that it ended up being really important to me to reinvent myself, because that inner work at that time, and this is something I don't really talk about that often, but essentially a part of my survivor story started in high school and in middle school. So by the time I got here, by the time I got into the city, I had to completely shed the me that I was. So the me that I was kind of reserved or, to the wall. Mm-hmm. The best analogy that I had for that was during high school, I was the one that took everybody's photos as opposed to being in them, or as opposed to actually smiling like wholeheartedly with my whole face. Like a lot of the time now, like, which can be like, the opposite end of the spectrum, slightly vain, whatever, but I'm like, no, because I remember there was a time where I didn't genuinely smile in photos, or I didn't want my photo taken at all. So by the time I got to city, I was growing my hair out for the first time. It's natural, cut it all off, and was able to actually create my own path that didn't have anything to do with any outside expectation of what was trendy or what was cool or what was popular or whatever at the time, especially early 2010s. And that ended up me being stubborn with what I wanted to study, because folks were like, international studies, what are you going to do with that? I'm like, I can do anything. Which is very much the freedom that I wanted. So I kind of deviated slightly and let people talk me into history, and I was like, this isn't what I wanted, but okay. And then I think I did that for like a year, and I switched off. I was like, okay, keep history as a minor and then go into international studies. And apparently I decided to do that at the right time, because that program was in a transitional space. I always find that in my journey of the past 10 years, I end up being in a transitional space, whether I'm going through a transition or somebody in a community is, or the community itself is transitioning. So in the case of the International Studies program, it was transitioning from Dr. Fernando's leadership to that in-between space. And I don't know if it was because I was born on the solstice. I'd like to think that that's what it is. I was born on the longest night of the year. So I'm at least in the this hemisphere, the northern hemisphere. So I've kind of always been like, okay, so we're in this space, all right, cool, like we're here, like as opposed to ignoring seasonal affective disorder. I will wear something obnoxiously bright when it's really gray. But I think that because of that in between, or that nighttime space that I'm comfortable with, when I see those kind of transitional spots, I'm like, all right, cool. Whereas other people will be like, whoa, and it's not a shade. It's just that some people need steadiness, or some people need the foundation to be there. Whereas I'm like, oh, okay, cool, we can try this, and by the time I look again, I've built something. So that's what, like, but the challenge with that is of like having built communities. So the International Studies Club, which is how we met, because my goofy self was like, hey, come to this meeting. We're like, huh? Like, we have a club for the major? What? And then at the time with Sister Circle Collective, which was really just us trying to take the magic of the class and make sure that people had it outside of the class, and like integrating certain things around intersectional feminisms, and really just experimenting of like, if it works, it works. As my friend Jess would say, whatever is clever, whatever works. And then, so that ran, I was in IS leadership for 2 years, did Sister Circle for 5, which is wild. It's coming up, everything is like coming up on either 10 years of completion or 10 years of like doing the things. And I think that for me, especially here in the city, because I'm an only child, then people in my life ended up being a part of my community, which the push-pull there is that I may value friendships more than other people.
And is that true for the communities that you've built as well?
Yeah, there's a seriousness to it, but not serious as in like I can't have fun, but serious as in like if I said I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna do it, and if I can't do it well, then I shouldn't do it anymore, or should the baton be passed, right? I think that a good example of that is the pause that Who Heals the Healer took because of the pandemic, and then because I was quite frankly tired of people not citing me. And that's a podcast for another time. But the good news is I trusted the community that I had built with that project to say, hey, I actually want to pass the baton, because to me, leadership is actually not centered in that one leader. That's not sustainable. Not only like strategically, but just in general. That's not to have something wrapped around or centering one person. That's not a community. Although we have so many different ancestors and people in us, I'm like, yeah, technically we're a community, but it's not this example. But I was able to successfully pass the baton to 2 folks, but one of them specifically, Paula, she remembered me from Sister Circle days. She said, I remembered how you made everybody feel in that space. So I trusted you when I read the email that said, I'm looking for people to, to step into this. But I know that that's the challenge of when you build something really well, is that folks may have their own like, oh, I can't do it like they did, or like whatever. And I experienced that too, but I'm like, actually, like that's the point. It should not be, you should not do it the way that I did. You should do it the way that you did, because we're all our own individual people with our own stories. But I can say that, and if people aren't ready, then people aren't ready. And I think that the ebb and flow there of some of the communities that I've built is to know when it's time to let go. and to recognize when something my mother says to me all the time is that sometimes it's not the club, so it's not IS, it's not Sister Circle, it's not Who Heals the Healer, it's not Ancestors in Training, it's not any of the other 5011 things that I've done because I do a lot. My mom tries to remind me that it's not the group, it might be that people came to a space and were vulnerable and I held them in whatever way, so they'll come around or they'll circle back because of me. My mom has always been like, it's not the group, it's you. And I'm like, Ma, but it was a group. And she's like, yeah, but the people that you cultivate communities with, they might remember how you made them feel, right? And I'm sure that they're in the collective spaces, other folks have other moments with other people in those constellations, right? There's some connects that other folks had with other people in the group, and that's just the nature of group dynamics.
Yeah, what I'm getting from that is that it's not necessarily the container, it's what's happening inside the container.
Yep.
And that's really where the magic is.
That's where it is. That's the whimsy of it, because I'm not trained in any of this. People are like, oh, so you must have went to school for this. And I'm like, no, I'm just winging it. Like, you're just witnessing me winging it and learning and trying to find different ways of either facilitating or showing up or not showing up, right? I think that there's, what is it? I understand how much energy or how much of a presence I have in spaces, and the contrary point to that is I know what it means to withdraw. So I know what happens if I give my energy, if I give my ashe to a space, and then I understand that even if I say, okay, y'all, like I gotta take a step back, I gotta do this, I understand what it means when people are like, oh, but I'm like, I told you, like plain it, especially if I have the text, I'm like, I said it right here, you know, and that's more so about other folks than it is me, but it's just more so the more that I am embodied and the more that I tend to myself, even in the spaces where I'm not facilitating or where I'm not leading, it's just a presence thing. The only challenge there is like, sorry, I'm laughing internally because this is something I always go through. It's about managing other people's expectations of me, of like, because I'm so consistent and because I'm, quote, always there, right? Like that cutoff, even if I warn folks, can feel harsh. And again, that's not about me, it's more about how I made them feel.
And in that regard, what has the internal journey been like for you? Because creating is not easy. The dissolving of that creation is not easy. Being a leader is not easy, you know, and not being like academically or professionally trained to do the thing adds another layer of challenge on it. And you're going through your own human healing journey throughout that entire thing. So what has that been like for you internally?
Sometimes it's chaotic. Sometimes it's very like, sometimes it feels like being in the eye of a hurricane. So like the eye as in like, I see like all the things spinning around or all the different me's that I was in a particular era. And then I have to stop like in that eye and actually go, okay, what can I continue? What feels good to me? What doesn't feel good anymore? And I think that in some of those choices to dissolve or sunset things, I had to grieve whatever me that I was in that era, because it almost, it's like the universe is the thing. It almost always syncs up with some kind of other transformation. So when Sister Circle sunset, I left Manhattan that summer and I moved to Brooklyn. But then the other side of that is like, if sometimes when you sunset things or you dissolve things or you let things go, that makes space for new things to come in. I think that that's been one of my grounding things in the internal work, because I'm like, all right, in order for something to take up space, you have to make space, right? You can't hold on to everything, and after a certain point, holding on to something, especially if you have nails like mine, you're gonna hurt yourself, right? With making a closed fist. So I think that some of that internal work has been that. What else has been internal work? Losing folks or gaining ancestors, depending on how you look at it. That is always a time of reflection, especially during those touch points, because it'll end up being where I'll create something, like a lot of people, in the midst of grief, and then on the other side of it, it'll be something else, like something else is starting, gained something, lost something, changed jobs, didn't change jobs, left this other thing. I'm trying to think, what else is the internal work? We were joking about it before, but like changing my aesthetic or my hair, like growing it out, cutting it off, getting braids, doing this. And I think that plays out in my relationships too, of all kinds. Like I'll gain friends, lose friends, like it always sinks in those moments or those eras, because I know when Sister Circle, this is the easiest example I can think of, when Sister Circle collapsed, that's when Who Is the Healer and Ancestors in Training came out.
So your cycle of community building, and I see that as an extension of what you were saying in the beginning of like it's almost like the ways in which that you've been healing yourself has been through the creation of communities.
Yes, and stepping up in them or stepping back from, or just, sometimes the communities that I end up being a part of end up healing too. So like Who Is the Healer is coming up, Ancestors in Training is like a writing circle only, and I'm like geeking and thinking out loud with my friend Shira about what that looks like. And then I get into the nightlife circuit, and some of the people that I know from that time are now like super crucial to my life period, but then also just I've been able to collaborate with in ways then where I can weave like, okay, I know this person from this part of my life, I know this person from that part of my life. Even as a kid, like I would even as a kid, if somebody didn't mess with somebody, my birthday, I tried to make my birthday Switzerland. I tried to make it like, okay, y'all don't like each other, but you love me. Like, but very much like still that kind of energy. But then also, so what is it? That was 2017. That's 6 years ago. So now I'm in the similar position where it's like, okay, I've went from living in New York City for 13 years to I went back home. That was a whole internal work, because I'm so used to the freedom and the me that I have been in New York City, and the varying different iterations, to going back home and actually saying, okay, well, what do I want the next couple of years of my life to feel like, as opposed to the traditional, like, oh, so where do you see yourself in 5 years, and what about this, and like even the wild thought of like, oh, my parents definitely had me at this age. I was like 3. I was like, huh? Like, I still feel like a kid. I don't know if I like so, but some of that internal work has been those kind of conversations of like managing not just outside expectations, but my own, because I can be hard on myself. I can be very much like, I thought I was gonna do this and I thought I was gonna do that. Like, tried grad school twice, that did not work, because by the time I did it, I was like, I know this already from community, so I don't know if I want to go into debt for this. Like, that doesn't sound like the smartest investment. And really thinking about the internal and like what I want my descendants to feel, what I want my community to feel, but also how do I want to feel? Because I feel like because I give so much, like when I withdraw, I'm able to reflect on what I want the next variant to use a comic book analogy to an next variant of my life to be.
Do you feel like, so I know for myself, a lot of the times I can be so externally oriented in my service that it's like I'm doing this work for me because I enjoy it and it's really what I want to be doing. But because the work itself is so externally focused, do you find that you lose that often, where it's just like, a minute ago I was doing it for me, but now I'm doing it for you and I didn't even realize.
Yeah, or like I was doing it because I felt like I had to and not because I wanted to. That's how that usually shows up for me. Like if I have this like idea that like, oh, I'm Veronica from XYZ, or like people know me from this and this, and then when I invite them into welcome to the variants, like there's multiple Veronicas, like in that promotional voice, it's been challenging because sometimes we all contain multitudes, and I feel like sometimes, especially when you're service oriented, people are used to the one that was in service as opposed to the one that actually needs to be received. So for example, I hate asking other people to help me. I hate it. The only child, hyper independent person in me, especially as a Black woman, is like, nah, I got it, don't worry about it. So I did that with my mom the other day when I was small example, bigger spectrum of things. I did that when my mom asked me to move some luggage, and I shouldn't have did it because I had recently like tweaked my back or something. I don't know what I did. Did it anyway. Messed with my back, and my mom heard me make the hiss of like, I'm in pain, and she was like, no, and I was like, no, I'm already in the midst of it. Let me finish. I should have left it where it was. I should have just left it and let other people that are stronger than me do it. But no, I'm gonna finish it. No, I'm gonna do it. No, I don't like leaving things unfinished, even if it's just a small thing. I was like, yeah, this is a metaphor for other stuff. I'm gonna remember this. I'm gonna, put some salon paws on my back and go like that and take some sick time. Because I know myself now, but I know I'm like, all right, if I like aggravated a part of my body, there's some part of my mind where I've probably done the same thing, where I've known that something wasn't necessarily for me anymore, or I've known that I've come against somebody's idea of me and lost. And then sometimes that means I'll lose that friendship, I'll lose that relationship because whatever me I'm evolving into, it doesn't compute for them anymore, or the proximity that I have to other folks, and then people like navigating friendships where it's like, okay, do you want to be my friend, or do you want to be friends with me because of whatever people I'm connected to?
The ways in which you can serve them.
The ways in which I can serve them, and therefore like you might want to heal through osmosis through being my friend. But then I'm the bad guy. I'm like, like sometimes I've particularly gotten comfortable, I want to say, in the past 3 years of being the villain in somebody's story, because like the proverb that says, as long as the hunter tells the story, the lion will always be the villain. So I'm like, meanwhile, the lions might have been chilling, and then they got interrupted and they got persecuted. Like, we all have different stories, we all have different takes, but I think that for me, it's been, the inner work has been around wanting to be a resource, or wanting to be sociable, and wanting to be in the mix, and then potentially being hot and cold. Like sometimes I'll literally just put myself in timeout. My mom said as a kid she did not have to put me in timeout. I literally would dismiss myself in my room and lock the door. Also, I had a lock on my door. Not everybody had a lock on their door. And I would put myself in there, probably play The Sims or do some other young stuff, and then I would come out when I was ready. So I think I still have that tendency of
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I'm gonna go be in the woods with my mom and reset my whole expectations of what I thought my 30s was gonna be like, because I thought I would still be in the city. I'm like, there was a grief there. There's always a like, okay, this time or this era or this me is complete. You know, like I've learned as much as I can. Because sometimes it's detrimental to stay in those same places. It's like a plant that's outgrown a pot.
Right.
It was just like that time one of my plants literally tipped over and fell out of the pot that it was in. My aloe plant that I still have, she decided to tell me that it was time to grow because she fell off the fridge. It's the funniest thing, and I actually had to sit and I was like, all right, this is a metaphor for other things. Like, okay, sit. And I think that sometimes I have to, the internal work is also journaling. I like writing things down and remembering how I felt about X when I'm all the way back in the alphabet cycle at like G or something. It's like, oh, you know, when you felt this, like, here's this feeling. It's like a spiral analogy. Like, oh, okay, here's this feeling again. Do you want to feel that same way again, or do you want to move forward?
Mm-hmm. There's two things that you touched on. I wanted to come back to, and they're separate points. The first one being the difficulty that you have in asking for help or letting yourself being helped. That to me is a fascinating dynamic because, and this is definitely something that I've experienced within myself as well, of wanting community, building community, while also internally maybe not allowing yourself to actually lean on that community that you're building, which was intentionally built to be of service to you because that's what you were building it for yourself, for your own healing process. So how has that dynamic played out for you? You know, the building of community, but then maybe not allowing yourself to really fully lean on
it. For Who Is the Healer, it was, okay, cool, I'm gonna do this thing. And then it turned into a whole conference and this thing that was like wildly bigger than me. And I had to be like, okay, nah, I need help. People asked me if they could help. And I was like, nah, I got it. Did not have it. Did not have it. It went well. Everybody had a good time. But I was running around. I wasn't able to fully center in the thing. Like, I remember the first year, I quite literally did the opening introductions conversation with my grandmother. And then after that, ping, 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 ping. Like, just ran around. Everybody else, to this day, oh, that was so great.
Right.
Some of the people that are interconnected now to this day, it happened because of that. So I often find that being the connector means that I'll sow the threads of community and then people are in community with each other, which is the point. But then the good news is I listened to everybody that after that year and built a team and then started doing the work. Not necessarily immediately after, but like, a couple of months afterwards, I was like, all right, I need a team. I don't want to do that again. I don't want to not be able to be present in the thing that I built. So sometimes I think it's trial and error. Sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, I got it. And then like, no, you don't. No, you don't. Like, name the thing. So I think that it's been like about navigating a tolerance, because I feel like sometimes my tolerance for things is pretty high, or like I'll either put up with certain things that are like negative emotions, like so pain or the spectrum of negative emotions, and or like not, I don't want to call feelings negative, the spectrum of feelings that are often given a bad rap. That's how I'll say it. I try to push through them as opposed to sitting with them long enough to understand the medicine that they're trying to teach. So I sat with it that year for Who Is the Healer. Trying to think, where else did I navigate those kind of things? I think one of the lessons that I found is that often when my projects are growing or a community is growing, there's no such thing as perfect. but there'll be like, let's say 2/3 of my life are going swimmingly, you know, like friends and community, family, job is solid, and then relationship might not be perfect. And it's always those three, but it rotates what part is like where I'm not getting a need met. So I think what I learned from my last relationship is that you can be all in it and the other person in it isn't, and then it feels like you might as well just be by yourself, or you might as well just focus on where the love is, and very much like moving with that orientation as opposed to just going with the motions or being the one that always tries. And I think that that's a thread too. Like I'm very much action oriented, very much like, okay, cool, let's figure it out. Like even if we get it wrong, let's try. Not everybody's like that. Or even what my idea of failure is somebody else's success, or like vice versa. I'll be like, okay, I tried, like I did a thing. Or like even with managing my own expectations around work and how I show up in the world, and trying to understand that I have a bigger rep than I realize. Like there's people that know me and like yeah, sure, I'm like, okay, cool. Like I just decided to do a thing. Like this whole idea of like being present on the internet and like social media and all that kind of stuff. I'm like, if people resonate, it resonates. Like if it doesn't, it doesn't. But I think that for me, it's hard sometimes to be received the way that I show up for other people, because this is no fault of anybody else, but I'll remember the times that I asked for help, or I asked for something that's super, super simple, I didn't get it. And I'm like, well, if you can't show up for me at this level, I can't ask you for something on the higher.
All right, yeah. So
then I won't ask you at all, which is not sustainable.
Yeah.
It's not. Don't do that. Or avoid that as much as you can. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but it's very much like if I give you a little inch, or if I give you a preview, I was like, hey, so like this is this community of my life, trying to integrate multiples, and like if it doesn't gel, then it doesn't gel. But if you can't show up for me in a simple way, then when you show interest and say like, or what is it? I'm trying to think of another example of that. When men that claim to be interested in me, and I'm saying it very specifically, when men that claim to be interested in me say, oh, we should hang out. Like, okay, yeah, you know I don't live in the city anymore, right? So you're gonna have to plan. Yeah, I'll hit you up. Never do. Next time I see them, oh, what happened? I'm like, you said you were yeah, you never did. Like, I'm very much in the space now, like, where I want to see the people, I want to do the things, but I'm like, no. Like, you asked, I told you what to do, or not told you what to do. I invited you to make a choice. You didn't make the choice, and then now you're gonna make it seem like I'm the bad guy. I'm like, no, I was just quite literally minding my business, probably still playing The Sims, annoying my mother, or doing some kind of combination of the things, watering my plants, like very much comfortable with the community and the relationships that I do have. So I'm very much not, one of the things I learned from my last relationship is that I'm not begging for anybody's attention in any form. Whether that's like recognition on socials, like being invited to things, which is wild because that was one of my biggest insecurities as a teenager.
What?
Not being invited to something.
Okay.
Or being out of the mix. Where my mom actually said that to me. She was like, you know how, she pointed out that spectrum. She was like, you know, you used to go, like you used to be sad that you weren't invited to things, and now you have to turn things down. She was like, you realize that, right? And I was like, well, I would hope that I've evolved from 14-year-old me that was very, I'm still sensitive, but 14-year-old me was very, she was healing, and she was very very insecure about things. So I think that the only challenge with having lived so many different versions and like the integration there is like I now recognize when 14-year-old me pops out. I'm like, oh wait, hold on, okay, like how can people talk about inner child work, and I'm like, like that's not always. It's not for the faint of heart, especially depending on what happened to you when you were a kid. Even if things go, stereotypically right, you grow up in the right environment, all the things, the world can be a lot of things and can be cruel. So I think that for me, I try to, it's not cherry pick, but I try to find the parts from my childhood that I'm like, okay, I had a passport at like 1 year old, like little baby Veronica going off to Germany with her parents, and then traveled like 13, 14, 15, like went to 10 countries in like 3 years. So like for me, I'm like, all right, like there's parts of my childhood that I'm absolutely bringing back up to the forefront and doing things that 13-year-old me would be really proud of at like 33. But then also understanding that the same way that I sometimes hate asking for help is directly rooted in when I was younger and I would ask and people wouldn't show up or people wouldn't respond. And it could have been that I asked the wrong people. Could have been. Or it could have been that I held on to it until I was ready to say something. Like there's very much like, even with my survivor story, I didn't say anything to my mom until like a couple months or so after it happened, and then I didn't tell my dad. Like famously did not tell my dad for years because I was afraid of what would happen to the other person, because my dad is retired military. So like I was like, now we're gonna hold on to this, and everybody responded well, but it was very much like a why didn't you tell me? And I think that that's what I've learned. I've tried to be very much like, because especially as a Black woman, this whole like super woman type archetype that not only gets placed on us, but we sometimes play into. I think that the way that I counter that at times is when I set my boundaries and say I'm at my limit, or when folks invite me to things and I can't go, I'm like, that's great, but it'll take me 2 hours to get there, and then I'll be tired by the time I get there, so probably not.
In the vein of archetypes that come with gender and race, through your various communities and community building, how has that played a role? Like both like race and gender, both in terms of you as a facilitator and the dynamic of the space itself.
At its worst, it'll mean that I do a lot of the invisible labor. So that'll be like socials, flyers, administrative type things. That's at the worst. At its best, it looks like a community of fellow Black and brown BIPOC folks, right? But I think that because I've seen what happens where the intersectionality of it, like, so what's a good example? Millions March NYC, which is almost 10 years ago. Time is weird. And had it being a contingent that was focusing on women and femmes that had been killed by the police and gender non-conforming folks, and then seeing people in Asada taught me hoodies. Look at us, like we were wild. I was like, you've got Asada on your shirt, bro. Like what? Like you've got Asada on your shirt, and you're looking at me like I'm the wild one. Like no, like this should not be a thing. Like we should understand, like, or I would like to think that we should understand like the ways in which intersectionality even plays out in our movements, and how we want a better world, and we can, because create and destroy. We created the thing. We can just destroy it, you can redirect that energy. But I think that sometimes folks, it'll look like the women and femmes of a movement doing all of, quote, all of the work, and then men or male identified folks getting the credit or getting the reputation. Sometimes that plays out in collectives where I've been a part of it, where sometimes folks had a reputation of being an organizer because of what I did. That's the only challenge. I'm like, all right, like if I wanted to, I could, but no, we're not gonna name names because we're evolved now, we're grown, and we're doing the things. But it's also just very much like that kind of letting go and being very much like, okay, like I can't change that person. I can, low-key change some of my behaviors and like what I allow and say, okay, even if this means that this is gonna end, I'd rather it end, So even like in the Who is the Healer analogy of like, I lost myself in that question, so I had to stop. I was like, I can't see myself in here, and that feels disingenuous, so I'm gonna, we're gonna pause. We're gonna pause. It was like the beginning of the pandemic. We really couldn't be in community with folks in person. But I think that it's hard sometimes to not play into those stereotypes because they're so prevalent. They're like, we're swimming in all of it. Like we're swimming in cishet hyper capitalism, and like especially in this moment where everything is collapsing. And I find that at times will play out even when I'm not thinking about it, but especially depending on how people know me. If people know me for healing work or whatever, then they think of me in one lane. If people know me in nightlife capacities, then they know me in that lane. Very few people are in that overlap. Very few people understand that I'm like, I could be very relaxed and chilling and whatever, or I could be in my whites. I can be with my elekes, I can be in ceremony, and then go home, change the outfit, and be, dancing and doing the things. And sometimes folks typecast me. They're like, oh, I didn't know you got down like that. I'm like, huh? Like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm a full human being. I have needs. Like, I feed everybody else. Like, I'm allowed to show up in my multitudes. And then I think the challenge there is because I show up in my multitudes, if people aren't integrating their multitudes, then it's like, and they start fussing, or they start throwing shade, or they want to be my best friend in like 5 seconds, which is not sustainable either. Like, it's very much like this feeling of sometimes being out of body, because if people typecast me in one archetype, but then when I present in another one, it's like, whoa. I'm like, the fuck are you, like, what is,
so,
like, why, like, why is this a thing? And I'm like, that's because not everybody does the inner work, Veronica, that's fine.
I'm super curious about that because, and that goes back to the other question that I was at a get at before, was when you said that people villainizing you. And I am very familiar with that within myself as well and on my path. And I feel like that's super connected to what you're pointing to now. And so as a facilitator of healing spaces, and so much of the way that I understand healing to be is the integration back to a place of wholeness.
Yep.
So what is that experience like for you as when you're in the role of not even in the role of a facilitator, but just like in the world, just like just you as, being you. What is that like when like you're playing, in their eyes, you're playing the role of a facilitator of healing through their one-dimensional view of you, and now things are coming up within them that you see is about them.
Yep. big mirror time.
Right. So how do you handle those moments of mirroring?
Sometimes I dismiss myself. Like sometimes it'll be this out of body moment in the party where I go home. I'm like, nope, abort mission, about face, forward march, out the door. Send the Uber link to everybody to let them know that I got home safely. Gone, right? That feeling somatically is being in a high capacity, stereotypical New York City, Brooklyn bar that I adore and I'm going to later. And feeling alone in the midst of the thing. The second I feel that way, I'm like, nope, we gonna cry. We gonna cry, we gonna go home. Like, don't cry in front of people, but go home. Like, because the other thing is, like, if I actually, like, boo-hoo, like, let myself cry, I end up getting sick afterwards. So I'm like, nope, go home. Go home. And I'm like, there's a whole somatics mind body thing about what I just said, but we're gonna put a pin in there. What else does that look like? That looks like me being rejected. It looks like people giving me mixed signals. It looks like people saying like one thing, and then if I actually match that energy, it'll be, I'm trying to get this quote directly. You know, too many of my friends know you would do that voodoo stuff on me. Or if I don't, if it doesn't work out, then I can't go to this party, or I can't go to this. I'm like, why would you think that us trying something and it collapsing, why do you think I would be like, oh, you can't let this person in? You really think I would be moving around like that? Which to me says, oh, somebody has done that to you. There's a quote of Chloe Bailey where she's like, if I get a vibe, I just dismiss myself. That is, I'll just dismiss myself. And then people go, oh, where did Vero go? I'm like, in the woods, watering the plants, annoying my mom, doing journaling, creating. And then that's usually the space in which I create sometimes. Like, not all the time, because that's not sustainable. I'm very much team, we should not have to experience grief and other wild and deep and less than ideal feelings to create the best things. For a while, that's where I was, and I was like, no, I don't want it to be like the deepest or the saddest point of my life for me to create something really wonderful for community. I was like, that's not sustainable, friends. Like, no. So I'm definitely out of that space now, but I know that some of the archetypes that will also show up is really also in my presentation, like how I do or don't dress. Like, especially in this present moment, the good news is, like, folks see somebody, and this isn't always the case, but like if people see someone in like the archetype of what they think a healer is, which for me will happen in big functions or whatever, gatherings where someone will say, oh, I know what type of time you're on if you're in your whites. And it'll be a good thing from depending on who that is. I'm like, oh, okay, so like, you know that I'm holding space for other people, or I just rolled over and that's what I decided to put on. But and then even on the flip side, like when I go to functions and I go to things, I have to, like, this, my spirituality and my practice, like, gives me a lens to interact with people. But I also understand that the archetype within that is like, oh, Veronica's really deep. I'm like, yeah, I am. Like, you should, like, do you want to be shallow? Like, not that you can't be shallow. I'm like, but do you want to? I'm like, I'm not asking you to go all the way over here, but I'm like, can you meet me halfway? Like, can we talk about how interconnected everything is? No? Okay, I'm gonna just go back to, dancing or whatever it is that I was doing. But like, I'm trying to think what other ways does that show up. That also shows up in, because all of these archetypes that people place on me are without my consent. There's no consent there. I didn't say like, oh yeah, you can typecast me as insert something here.
And how do you maintain? Because I know you said that you usually exit the scenario if there's an environment that is typecasting you or projecting something onto you. When you are then with yourself, what do you then do to? And where the question is really coming from is I know that for myself, when I started going through that heavy in terms of navigating the ways in which people see me and are projecting stories onto me, I've had to go through my own internal process of figuring out what my truth is, you know, what my internal compass is, what are the pillars upon which I know I base my reality. And for you, and from what I know of you, ancestry and your work with your spirituality has a huge part to do with how you ground yourself in truth. So can you speak a little bit about that process or that internal experience? And I'm assuming that is what led to the birth of Ancestors in Training. Of like, this is my medicine that I cultivated for myself. Hey y'all, check this out.
It's literally a thought experiment, and my friend Shira entertained it. Like that's how it went. Because I was writing, it still is and was the vehicle to answer the first part of your question of like, well, what happens? You know, what's the internal thing that you tangibly do? Is that I'll write about it. So I'll either free write. I used to blog a lot, like like 2017, 18, 19, and the pandemic happened, and I still write, but like I wasn't as consistent about it, or like edit. I wasn't as consistent about being public with what I was writing because not everything is for the internet. Not everything is for public consumption. Sometimes it's just for us. So like that would also be poems, like writing a lot of like off the top. I call them 5-minute litanies because it only takes me 5 minutes to do it. And people are like, what? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Like that's why I'm like, I'm a reluctant, poet. So that's like one way that I do that. But then also within like the Ancestors in Training or like ancestral veneration, curiosities, noticings, it took some time to integrate like the writing piece of how I show up in healing spaces and facilitating that with something that I was already doing, which was unearthing and curious about some of my ancestral lineage because of some of the losses that I've had in my family. So primarily starting with my paternal grandmother, my paternal uncle, my maternal great uncle, like very much like had a string of losses, but especially, which this goes back to the first question, some of my best community building or some of the ways in which people know me the most came because I was grieving. So like even the internet, like even how we know each other, that was when my grandmother and my uncle died back to back. Like very much like trying to find ways to learn how to take care of myself and learn how to heal. And then immediately after that, that's how we got Sister Circle, right? Of like being, well, not necessarily how we got it, but like that was my emotional backdrop of like grieving some of the biggest losses of my life at that time. So here we are now. I'm trying to, not always have it be that, the world has to stop or like I lose somebody to be able to create some of these things, or like what I invite people to do now at Ancestors in Training is very much like talk to your elders while they're still here. Because a lot of the questions that people see on socials or resonate with a lot are really things I wish I could have asked my grandmother before she had dementia. Which a lot of people, I mean, I talk about it, but not everybody, like, it's like, I say it, but like, did y'all really hear me? But, and not just about things that were less than ideal in her life, but things like, okay, so what brought you joy? Or like, even a tangible way that I do that is a couple of years ago, I try to give my grandmother flowers on her birthday. Flowers on her birthday and then flowers on her transition day. But I had to ask my dad what her favorite flowers were because I didn't know. Like, literally called, like, Daddy, what was grandma's favorite flowers? It's like roses. It's like, any kind of roses. Red. I was like, okay. He's like, why do you want to? I was like, don't worry about it. Click. But thinking about it in that way, trying to do like little things like that. That's what it looks like for me. Ancestors in Training again is like this big experiment of like, okay, so since our time here, sign it. What are we gonna do? And like, while we're still here, how can we navigate the legacy that we want to live? And also leave behind. So I think that experiment has grown into something that's also way beyond, little old me. I'm just like, I'm just the steward of this thing. However it goes, again, as my friend Jess would say, whatever is clever on that platform, but also understanding that some of that may also be ancestral because my grandmother, who's still living, and at the time of this recording, her birthday was yesterday. She started the day by talking about, this similar thing of being connected to something beyond. Except in her case, she was saying how she wished she had have cultivated her gift as opposed to not cultivating it. Because she said, she was like, it's like a muscle, like the premonition or the seer type archetype that and the gift that she has. She said to me, she was like, but I only would see bad things. I would only know when somebody's hurt or about to die, as opposed to the joy. So she was like, I stopped tuning into it. Except now, in my later years, I find ways to center enough to be able to filter the noise. And the 360 of that is that my grandmother only feels comfortable talking about that because I started talking about ancestors. And I started to talk about legacy building and what do you want to do, and she's hilarious. She'll say like, because I'm an ancestor in train, like in casual conversation, talks about it all the time. I have to make her own hoodie for her birthday. That's what she wanted. But but I just think that it's so it's really great that I can alchemize some of the things within my family, or just because everybody's, especially when you start doing ancestral work, and not all of it is easy. Like not everybody became an ancestor, especially in this moment of like a lot of grief and death. Like not everybody becomes an ancestor in a way that's like, they lived their best life, like it was their time. Like sometimes people leave this earth in really tragic ways. So I think that through doing this work, I've been able to navigate grief in different ways. I've also been able to listen more, especially within my family, with how that shows up, like what I just said with my grandmother. Or the other podcast episode of figuring out that my last name should have been Diandraji as opposed to Agard. Like that's a whole other podcast, but essentially my dad has a first cousin that he did not know until he logged into Ancestry.com one day, and it turns out that they're first cousins because of their fathers, and they both, my dad and the cousin, both didn't have really good relationships with their fathers, or did not have one at all. And I think about that a lot in terms of how my dad raised me and was and is a good father in spite of not having a model. But then the 360 of that is like around names and the naming of things and the power within names. I'm like, bro, that's not my last name. Like, what do you mean? Like, that's not. It's like I have so many questions of like, or it is, but it was my paternal great grandmother's name, and it wasn't her partner's name.
What is the impact of the healing journey that you've been on? What impact have you seen it have on your father?
If
any at all?
In the in the last name catharsis, metamorphosis, like what do we call ourselves moment, I was like, do I change my passport now? Like what do I like just like what do I do? Like do I fill out that form different where it's like you do you have any other names? How do I say this in a short amount of time? My father left Guyana when he was 2. That was the last time he saw his father. To this day, we don't know what happened to him. If he's still alive, he's like 102, I think, if I did the math right. Very old. But also, people in my family, both sides, live long lives. For all we know, he could be alive, just off the grid. Because of that, in my dad's immigration story, it left a bit of a, not a bit, I don't want to diminish it, it left a sore spot for him. Because my grandmother, rest her soul, wouldn't really, whatever she knew about where her husband was died with her. And even though she left him all the things, she still had a picture of the 2 of them by her bed. To which I was like, this is weird. Like, you said that he cheated on you and all this other stuff, but you had to put, I was like, I'm going to leave this alone, but I'm going to observe it. And then my dad did the same thing, just, observe, put a pin in it, like bring it up later. When my grandmother died, I realized that I had an aunt. Grew up thinking it was just my dad, my uncle, my grandmother, and me. Whole other set of cousins in St. Kitts that are wonderful people. I was able to go down there in 2018. And I went without my dad because the side of me was like, okay, like come, like we gotta go. And especially at that point, because it had been 6 years since my grandmother and my uncle had passed away. And the idea was we were gonna bring them back home and spread their ashes. My dad dragged his feet about it. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna go hang out with your nieces and nephews, like, and see what the fuss is about. Like, trying to understand, like, intergenerational trauma means that, like, that whole branch I did not know about, but they knew about me. And I was like, what is this? And I was like, oh, I'm grown. This all happened when I was a kid. We can be, yep, let's be in community. What's your number? WhatsApp? Okay, cool. Did that work myself. And let them know, and they welcomed me with open arms. I never met them in my life. We all look alike. I was like, this is weird. My dad was like, I was really upset with you when she went. And I was like, yeah, but sir, I had been asking you for like 6 years to go, and you didn't want to go, so I went. Because, being an adult means I can make choices, and, ideally I want you to agree with them, but every now and again I'm like, like, I'm gonna still make a choice. You might not like it. This time last year, we actually went back, all of us, because my dad and my stepmother like to cruise. That is I think that's a, retiree kind of thing to do. They cruise a lot, and their cruise had a day in St. Kitts. That was the first time my dad had been back in 50 years. And they brought my grandmother and my uncle's ashes back, and I didn't tell my dad I was gonna be there. He lied for like a good, he lied for like six months. 6 months, and I have a video of this where like I'm walking with some of my cousins to like go collect him, and he's like, oh, you guys are evil? Like, you guys have been planning this, like, let me do it. And I'm like, I love you too, hi, like, hello, like, we're gonna do it, right? Like, we're gonna spread their ashes. I know for a fact, if I didn't start talking about some of these things or asking questions about our lineage, and, my stepmom being very much tired of him being like, oh, I'm an alien. Like, we'll send all these alien-related memes of, like, beat me up Scotty in terms of his ancestry. And I'm like, bro, that's not funny. I'm like, this should not be funny. My stepmom got tired of him saying that and made him do the DNA test. And because of that, similarly to my grandmother who's still living, my dad will just randomly say things. I'll be like, yeah, I feel like my grandmother visited me in a dream. I'm like, what does she look like? Oh, she had silver hair, and I just remember her loving me. Like, how old were you? 2. Like, so I'm sitting there like that meme where the person is like, like, okay, so you casually have ancestors visit you and shit. I'm very much that Prince meme where he's like this. Like, you could have told me this when I first started talking about ancestors and trading or whatever, but a friend of mine, Eduardo, said that ancestors only show up when they feel like it or when they're ready or when they think that you're ready. So apparently that whole episode within the past, that only happened like 2.5 years, like since that revelation. And I think that ever since then, my dad has been, whimsical about some of the things, especially within the Agard line, because all he heard and did the research about it, he was like, oh, so we have a castle in Portugal? And I was like, that's not the takeaway, sir. That's not. I was like, no, because years ago, he wouldn't even be comfortable talking about this. Veronica let him crack jokes, or even some of the threads, once we pulled them on the D'Andrade line, he was like, is this my grandfather? And it's like this very white Portuguese looking guy, and my dad was like this, like like, what do you mean this is right? And I was like, I guess like our hair pattern is a little loose on the top, I don't know, like and so that's a couple of ways, like the ancestral work, like it shows up everywhere, but it shows up especially in my family now that I've just kind of been like,
just people being more open to the conversation.
Because they're more open to the conversation. When years ago, because I've had an Ancestry.com account, and this is not a paid endorsement. I've had an account since 2009. So I've been like, oh, so where did we come from? And then what about this? Oh, where's Guyana on the map? Oh, okay, so this, and then like y'all island hopped and then came here in 1968, and then mom was over here, and then I went to school. I was like, always doing that.
And it's interesting because so much of the healing journey starts with it being a conversation, just a comfortable conversation. Because a lot of what I'm trying to figure out is with the Achilles community is how to start having these conversations with men, and how to even recognize that it's a conversation that needs to happen. Like, I'm sure if you just one day, even before you started doing all this ancestry work, if you just went up to your dad and tried to start having the conversation, it wouldn't have happened as it's almost like there needed to be a marination process.
There needed to be a series of events for him to not necessarily get it, because I'm very fortunate my parents like very much understand like my whimsy, and like, oh, I'm gonna go over here, I'm gonna do this, I have this friend, or like I have this friend that does this thing. They very much understand and support me with that, but like my dad, I think had to, I don't want to say this. I think that sometimes stereotypes of masculinity include being stubborn and being very much like, I'm going to figure this out in my own way, in my own time. And I know how I can get when I'm like, no, I got it, don't worry. But going back to archetypes before, I was like my hyper independent streak, which isn't necessarily the most sustainable thing. And even within masculinity and in men, like, I only know this because I'm a bit of a data nerd. 90-something%, and this is binary, I apologize, it's not my fault, it's meta. Meta needs to do better about multiplicities of gender or lack thereof. But 90% of my audience on the metaverse is women, or women identified folks. The other 10% are men. Yeah. And I don't know what that's about, but I've definitely noticed that even within healing spaces, like which is a 360, a whole part of the reason why you're doing the work that you're doing, is that there aren't as many spaces for men and men identified folks to talk about some of these things in a way, because the way that masculinity is branded and uplifted is that doing these kind of things of like the healing work, like healing work is, not the work, or like, oh, what's that for, or that's not important. So all of these kind of things around ancestral lineages can get lost in the sauce of, oh, I don't need to worry about that. Like I need to go and collect all these coins and be a good little, capitalist and do all these things for me and consume all these things and these people and all this other stuff for me, and not because I want to leave the world better than how I found it, which I'm not mad at because we're all swimming in the thing. But like what you said, sometimes it takes people to hear the same thing over and over again, or for it to marinate, or for folks to quiet themselves enough to hear something. So I think for my dad, he the cousin that he has, he reached out to her one year and she didn't write back. And that actually kind of, that hurt my dad's feelings. He didn't actually say it, but I know him well enough to know in his mannerisms and his tone. I was like, that sucks. I understand. And I reached out to her too to be like, hey, that wasn't a fluke. Like, we're real people. Like, we're not trying to, speaking of capitalism, we're not trying to get resources from you. We're not like, oh, so where's the money? Like, we really just want to know. And when my dad wrote back to her, he wrote back to her on the anniversary when he first reached out. And then she wrote back, like, I thought that this was a fluke. I thought that you were one off. Like, I didn't want to believe it because it brought up all this other stuff for her, right? So I think that I wish that there were more opportunities for like men and like mask identified folks to be able to be vulnerable, because that historically, and some people would argue biologically, is not it's not a desirable trait, or like that's not how you're supposed to be. Like this whole like boys don't cry, like that whole rhetoric that we're fed into from low-key from D1 when we're like children, especially with how we're raised and how we're schooled. So I think that for my dad, it's been very much like a reclamation kind of space of like, oh, okay, like I can move this way, or I can do this, or I can have more conversations with my daughter who's like, like let's talk about this, let's document the things, let's have a record of how we were, or hanging out in the backyard smoking cigars that I brought back from Brazil, because that was my dad's one request. So I was like, oh, can you bring back? And then when I brought them for Father's Day, he was like, when are you going back? I was like, you're pulling my arm. Such problems. Yep, I'll give you more cigar. Very much. And then he was like, why do you know how to smoke a cigar? I was like, don't worry about it. Just enjoy the moment. Just enjoy the moment, sir. Don't ask questions you don't want the answer to. I love Dad. And they really, my dad, my whole family is super supportive with my journey. I know that that's not always the case. Especially when it comes to ancestral traditions, especially when it comes to like spirituality, like that's not, that's one of the common questions I get with ancestors in training and holding space of like what to do about either ancestors who won't support the way that you live and choose to express yourself and know yourself to be, or people in your family that are still living and breathing that don't want you to practice the thing. Like that's a whole other episode, sorry.
And how would you see, because in terms of the gendered dynamic of healing spaces, what do you see needs to change about the general environment? Because you've been in the healing community world for a while.
Like 10.
Yeah. And
going on 11, no, 12, damn. 12
yeah.
years, yeah.
And over the course of these 12 years, the ethos of the healing world has changed dramatically.
Super
through
dramatic.
like the mainstream of spirituality over the past 10, 15 years. So what do you see needs to change for it to be more accessible to men?
It's a really good question. I think, start off big, I think sometimes, broadly, this is not a gendered statement, sometimes it's hard for us to navigate with the intangible. So like something that you can't see, but you can feel it, something, it's not this couch, it's not this pillow, right? Like the second that you start asking people to do the inner work or to navigate things in their lineage, like that's not something you can't open yourself up and like go look at your DNA strand and be like, oh, this is the epigenetic marker for Veronica's hyper independent streak, right? To use myself as an example. Although with that example, I could probably trace it back to being a descendant of enslaved Africans, most likely. Yeah, probably. Yep, that's what we're gonna go with. But I'm me, and I'm already, in the weeds of this thing. So I'm like, all right, even in my like little analogy, I'm doing that work. Not everybody's comfortable with those conversations. Not everybody's comfortable, again, not gendered. And I also think that this goes back to vulnerability or being soft or like opening up, because sometimes, especially with the way that masculinity is branded and manhood is branded and uplifted, this whole strong archetype and, what's another toxic phrase? To tough it out or whatever. There's no room for healing work within that. There might be at the end of the life, right? Like when somebody, there's actually stats about that now as a sidebar, where when they talk about, and again, this is super gendered, folks in nursing homes and what that looks like, then there's a good chunk of that population that are men. And folks are using the analogies to be like, all right, like that could be because they didn't open up, they didn't take care of their partner, they didn't do the intangible work to maintain a relationship, and now they're alone, right? Or like now their kids don't want to see them, now their wife like put them in there and like never visited. Like there's a whole rabbit hole about that on TikTok that I somehow got on, I don't know how, but once I was there, I was like, all right, let me learn something now that I'm in this. The algorithm's like, you talk about ancestors and grief and death, and like, here you go. A world where that looked like is that, actually, backtrack a little bit. In my tradition, that's not the case. But I think that's because of the structure of Ifa, of the structure of the Sheshe descended traditions of like Kanumble, Santeria, and the like, because at its worst, it can be patriarchal, at its best, it can be, equally divided and things, because that world has a lot of gender dynamics in it that can make it so that way, patriarchy is still a thing, right? Within that, I see a balance, right? Of like, there are men in those traditions and those lineages, and there are women, obviously, and then now we're in a whole other space of like folks feeling safe enough or brave enough to be their full authentic selves within those traditions. It's not perfect, it's still evolving. So I was like, actually, let me think about it. It depends on the type of spirituality, it depends on the religion, it depends on the practice. So I'm not saying that to say that everybody needs to get initiated, because that's not the case. No, like it's very much like everyone's invited, but not everybody's gonna make it, or like they're gonna find their own medicine and their own tradition. But I also think that so much of the ancestral and spiritual work is contrary to capitalism, contrary to the ways that manhood has been described and prescribed, that one necessitates the other. So you have to dismantle or break apart or decolonize masculinity in order to be comfortable, in order to be vulnerable, in order to be brave enough to navigate some of the spiritual work, some of the inner work, some of the specifically like ancestral veneration and being in traditions. Like, it's gonna come up. Like, it's not a if, it's going to come up. Like, okay, you need to do more of this, less of this. Like, here's the prescription, do this, pray to this person, do this, don't pray to that. Like whatever comes up for you. But I think that a world where it wasn't as gendered would require that folks are more comfortable with expressing the range of their emotions and being vulnerable and not knowing the answer. Because, excuse me, I know that whatever I circle or whatever I'm in ceremony, or even if I'm holding a space, I don't know who's going to show up. I don't know if anybody's going to show up at all. People have registered for things with this Zoom virtual space. Means that sometimes folks register for stuff and like, oh, just watch the video. And then, haha, I'm like, some stuff was just for the room. Haha, gotcha. You're not gonna get that, but you'll get other things. But yeah, I think it would take like decolonizing and breaking down patriarchy within, in this case, within like a man's like identity, to be able to even be comfortable in those kind of spaces, which sometimes then plays out in like the work that I do, because I'm like, it's mainly women and femmes over here. I'm not mad at this, but it's for everybody, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Because I see that a lot of the block for myself, even on this path, was not even recognizing the pain that I was in, or not even recognizing my need for community, my need for a group of men. Like, the first time that I experienced a group of men holding space for me in the way that I'm cultivating through the Achilles community, it was mind blowing for me. I was like, oh my God, I didn't even realize I needed this to actually have a community of men. And what I'm loving about your response is that, and what I'm getting from it is that it's really about rebranding, rebranding masculinity, creating not even new narratives, because as you're pointing to within the Ifa lineage, there are so many narratives across human culture around what it means to be masculine, or to be a man, or even not even conflating the conversation of healing with gender.
Right.
And I think that's so much of the fuck of this situation. Is like, it shouldn't be a gendered conversation, but it does need to be a gendered conversation, because it's where we are.
Right. In order to move forward, we have to create spaces that acknowledge where we are.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, and that's where I'm finding the confusion or the complexity of where I'm finding myself is like, I realized that, again, for my journey also started like 10, 12 years ago in the healing world. And then through the journey, I realized that not only there was really, I was usually the only man in the space, and there was also very few white people in the space.
Yep.
And that's also something that I realized, where the intersectionality of race played into it, is I realized that the spaces where white people go to heal is very different than the spaces that people of color go to heal. And thankfully, because of the path that I've walked on, I've experienced a bit of both. And what I'm realizing for the conversations that I'm trying to have through the Achilles community is how do I talk about masculinity and manhood and things like that and have a gendered conversation at the same time as having a healing conversation, at the same time as having a conversation about how it shouldn't, not that it shouldn't be gendered, but that it's part of the branding and the illusion that we've been given and the narratives that we've been given.
Yeah, that's it's this very much like this circular spiral of like, this shouldn't be the thing, but since it is, like, here we are, like, here's what we're gonna do. And it's reminding me, even within Ifa, like, but then also the pantheon, if you will, of like how African traditional religions came over when folks were enslaved, and all of the varying iterations of that, of being in relationship with one's higher self and the forces of nature, because of my forces of nature that, you know, kind of ride with me all the time. Mine are stereotypically very masculine. Even my feminine Orisha or Ya is very much like, can be in folklore where people talk about like the bearded lady or like a Joan of Arc, like went and did like stereotypical like masculine things. But then my primary Orisha, Shango, I think especially, is a very, when you go into the stories of him in the sacred text, like there's one where I want to say he gets tricked or he gets deceived, and he's one of the only Orishas who was a human first. And he was so ashamed of what he did in terms of like harming people. This is a super, super condensed version of it. But he was like, I don't deserve to be here. And like, content warning, like he chose to go to the other side, right? But because he did that, the Orishas and the gods were like, okay, like you basically went through two ends of the extreme. Like you started off one way and you had this redemption story, and that's a part of, or at least one iteration of him, that's a part of how he became an Orisha, because Shango is very much about justice and balance, like double-headed acts. So like he went from one end of the spectrum of being like super violent, super angry, stereotypical masculine, to the other end of the spectrum where he had accepted like responsibility for what he did or didn't do, acknowledged how he felt about it, felt so ashamed about what he did, and then because of that he was rewarded in the afterlife and elevated into a space of reverence. I say that to say, having that as my primary Orisha, what that can look like is this line between doing all the things that I keep saying, doing all the things by myself, very much like doing all the things, moving forward, but then also not wanting to show the softer side, or wanting to isolate a little bit. It's kind of like what animals do in nature when they're dying or they're sick and they like go off somewhere. The only downside, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, the only downside of dismissing myself is that sometimes I can do it too much, or that I can be quick to anger a little bit. I can get spicy. My mouth can get reckless, and I usually have to go in a corner to like calm down, because it's like what's another analogy for this? The Hercules animated movie with Hades, and Hades will like flame up and then calm himself down. Like I'm like, and I'm like, no, Veronica, no, like don't, no. But then also understanding that like even within Shango, it's like what he's known for. Like a lot of folks will say like, oh, he's known for A, B, and C, like he's known for his virility, like his masculinity, but a lot of folks also don't necessarily point out that in the sense of synchronicism, which is how the Orishas hid within Catholicism and Christianity, he's associated with Santa Barbara, which is a female saint, because Santa Barbara had a similar story where she was unjustly accused of something and then put in a tower, and then I think she asked God for help or something, and then lightning was involved and like burnt down the town. Again, very, very dramatic, very, you know, fire, brimstone, like kind of energy, but also very rooted in justice and, you know, doing what is right, not right, doing what is ideal or what is with the best of humanity and kind and mankind involved. And one of the things that I learned recently is that not only is Shango about or the guardian of lightning and rides into battles with Oya and like they the hurricane, the tempest, the storm, and the lightning. Shango also is about the rain. That should have been obvious, but when somebody said it, like, it can be like going into battle, and it can also be like listening to the rain. It can be like not just the party and being the life of the party and at the bembe and spinning and being the orisha of the drums, which for me shows up in knowing all the DJs that I know and being a daughter of DJs and like all the things. For me, that also is like in that stillness, in the water, in that elemental space of like water being associated with emotions, right? Of like, okay, like Shango is a good example of like what happens when your emotions like take over in not an ideal way, and then what happens when, you know, you realize that and you want to do better and you move forward. There's a phrase in Yoruba that says the king did not hang, or the king did not die, which is how when you call him, like it's one of those call and response things. But I love that story of him because it reminds me to, you know, it's not that you can't be upset, but like, you know, think strategically, think about how you want to feel, allow your emotions to not take over you, right? Doesn't mean that you don't feel them, but don't stay stuck in them. Like, don't let it wash over you to the point where that's all you can think about. Or if that's, you know, sometimes that means, you know, what's going to happen is going to happen. And sometimes it means that, you know, we make mistakes. I know that I've definitely made mistakes from that, you know, the flame on, the flame on perspective, and being in this work now, I'm like, all right, but that goes back to what you asked me before about my inner work of like understanding what will anger me or upset me, and that's usually when folks disappoint me. But then the question is, did I have an expectation of that person, yes or no? Yeah. And like that inner work of breaking that down and bringing it to my altar spaces around like giving me courage for whatever it is that I want in that season or that cycle of life.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that story about like the nuance of Shango, because especially like, you know, in terms of my relationship to Shango through Capoeira and through Grupo Jinga and all that.
Shout out to Grupo Jinga.
Yeah, and Mestre Kiki. And the relationship between the aspect of Shango being not only lightning but also rain, and connecting that to what we were saying before about what healing is as the integration of the multitude, makes me realize or think about the narrative of what masculinity is or what being a man is needs to have nuance. And I think as the story is told right now, it is very linear, very one-dimensional in what it requires to be a man. So I really appreciate that response, because what I'm getting from it, and also the conversation back to what you were saying about your dad and your family, in allowing nuance to exist, we allow conversation to happen about the nuance and the different parts, and the acknowledgement of the different aspects of our humanity that goes beyond, because that was also part of the work in de-gendering the conversation, is to go underneath gender into we're human. Where I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday, and they said that, men are, boys are made into men too soon. And in my mind, it's humans are made into boys too soon. We're human. Let's figure out the human shit first.
So as opposed to it being 2 levels, you made it 3.
So and that's part of also what I'm part of the way that I'm trying to go at this work is like, let's go back to being human. And what I'm getting from this conversation as well is that same thing, is like making it nuanced, where like a storm isn't just the storm. And the lightning isn't just the lightning. The lightning is also the rain. The lightning is also the thunder. The lightning is also everything that comes with it.
It can be hail, it can be like little like misty, barely there rain, or it can be a whole hurricane. It can be the whole entire thing. And I think that, especially for me, like, this also goes back to what I was saying about like that internal work, and like what I said about being like, sometimes when I'm in a transition, I feel like I'm at the eye of a storm. It's because I understand like my relationship with my guardian Orishas, and I understand how that plays out, where like sometimes I used to want to try to run out of the storm. Like, okay, I want to skip this part. And it's like, no, stay your ass right here. Because also hurricanes are spirals, right? So like certain things that I thought I was past, or I thought I had evolved from, like, oops, nope, this still bothers you. Here it is again. Or like, are you going to do something different? Oh, okay, word. This person projected on you, made you the villain. You were just existing, holding a mirror, because you are a mirror, like minding your business. Are you going to internalize that? Or are you not? Right? Or are you going to... Sorry, I'm laughing because we've talked about this. The other side of the coin, sometimes if I'm not doing my internal work, is that I'll shrink. I'll shrink, I'll take my... Like, I keep saying I'll take myself off the board, or I'll dismiss myself, but even if I'm present physically, I know some eras of my life where I just shrank, or I didn't want to take up too much space, or I quite literally made myself small because I didn't want to be accused of taking up too much space, which has happened before, which is just, equal parts me existing, but then also like there might have been some moments where I overshared, or that push-pull of like needing community but also cultivating it. Like, I also understand myself in the sense of how I respond to things and how I speak. It's all the mannerisms of a lot of people, but specifically my grandmother, who's still living. Somebody described me as being winding and whimsical, but then also tactical. And I was like, yep. Like, depending on what I'm saying, I'm like, okay, story time. Oh, you thought I forgot the question? Nope. So it's very much like understanding that, but then also the different integrations, like understanding that the more that I was curious about, or like understanding the Orishas, and like as I'm about to go back to Brazil for the 3rd time in like less than a year, like understanding how different spirits or different energies will show up and like be like, knock knock, like here I am again, or hey, pay attention to me, you need to work with this, or like because I can have a fiery disposition, a lot of my work is to make sure that I am receiving, or that I can do more work with understanding my inner emotions, which is a lot of water, like very much like understanding and letting myself feel things and not trying to rush through the thing, because that kind of fiery energy can be very quick and wanting to move forward and figuring it out. And it's like, actually, no, chill, like relax, like you sit down, like go be in this sacred space, go do this thing, go listen to your elder, go listen to your Baba, go listen to your Iya, like sit and listen. I think that for me, especially as a space holder, I have to cultivate spaces on the flip where I'm listening or I'm being listened to, because that also, like the duality of that is like the balancing act very much of like, okay, like Veronica, but who shows up for you? And I'm like, hee, I'm like going to the drawing board at varying points of my life with that answer, because sometimes that changes. Sometimes the people, and there's a beauty in there, because sometimes the people that I didn't think or didn't expect to show up in a way that I needed will show up, and then that will balance out the folks that I thought were going to show up and for whatever combination of reasons didn't. And that helps me not take it personal, even though we're all humans having a human experience. And like, sometimes I'm gonna take it personal. It is what it is. I'm trying to think what else I want to say. It's like, there's so much I can say. There's so much that I can say to that, but it's also just like trying to remember to, and I think this is not gendered. I think because of the ways in which patriarchy and capitalism and all the things interconnect, racism, all the isms, all the phobias, all the things, I think that an invitation to doing this work of healing, of ancestral work, of anything that is not in direct relationship with all the isms requires us to slow down, requires us to do that inner work that is not instant gratification culture of like, you know, we even see this on social media too, of like, oh, DM me now for like insert this and like all your problems will be fixed. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Like, if it's quick, it's genuine, amazing. No shade. But the ways in which all the isms play out into that, especially now, like 10, 12, like maybe going on 15 years later of like having had language for healing and watching the world catch up, or watching our generation catch up, means it's like, word, I remember when I was talking about healing work in Sister Circle era, and there were male counterparts in our movement spaces that said, oh, they just sit around and light candles, they don't actually do work.
Yeah.
To now they're about this healing work and all this stuff. I'm like, not that I'm trying to call you out, but I remember when you said that wasn't the work. Like, sorry, the shock of me was like, of like, you can say that, but I remember when y'all said that wasn't the work that was valued. And I think that example goes into what we're talking about. Of like, work that isn't valued then gets diminished. It also gets gendered. It gets regulated to women folk or like femmes. It's like, oh, that's soft work. That's not.
So then this would be a question of how do we acknowledge the value of
healing. The intangibles, because healing is intangible. It's not. You can see it.
Thank you. That it
you
makes
can see it, but it's intangible because it's so inner. It's
the
not
value of the intangible.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate you pointing to that, because that's another huge critique that I even have of the healing world and healing community as it is being co-opted and cultivated right now, is the way it's being marketed and sculpted, like in the same way that like spiritual landscapes, whether it be waterfalls and things like that, are like treated as amusement parks and gift shops and things like that.
Yeah.
Spirituality as a practice is also being co-opted in the same way, and even the word healing is something that I for a very long time, and even to this day, I don't really identify myself as a healer.
Same.
But
people call us that though, which is the wild part. I'm like, I guess, sure.
Yes, if that's
the combination
your
of
experience,
words,
then that's great. But my critique of it is, again, it's becoming one-dimensional.
Yep.
And we're losing the mark. So I love that you're pointing to it as it's the intangible. Part of the language that I've acknowledged that is missing is that even saying internal, like what is your internal process?
Yeah.
Even for that is already above where most people, especially men, are, because we're and again, the focus being the value, and I think that is so key, and that's such a click for me right now in this conversation, is because what are we conditioned to value? And then that answer looks different depending upon the environment that the human grows up in, and whether it's race, gender, class, ability, any of those things. So that's a huge takeaway for me right now, is like it's valuing the intangible.
Yeah, and I think we're on the edge of the internal work being commodified via the word shadow work. Everyone's like, shadow work this, shadow work that.
But even that, it's like you bring light to a shadow, the shadow disappears.
Right.
So it's like you can't bring light to shadow work.
No.
That's not that's just not how that works.
Oh.
You literally can't.
Like, there's certain stuff you have to do without the lights on, with like nobody around, just like you and yourself, right? But like, I'm seeing that now because everyone's like, well, not everyone, like it feels like it though. It's like, oh, shadow work this and shadow work that. And I'm like, do you need internal work? Like, I'm just looking around like, is that what shadow? And I was like, okay, cool. Like, all right, everybody's talking about it, but what does, but I'm very much, and this is a product of our professors that we had at City College, very much like, okay, since everybody's talking about this, what is not being talked about? Let me go, like, look here. Like, critical media studies is like, I apply that even in healing spaces of like, like.
Shout out to Professor Anderson, Dr. G, Professor Biles.
Michael Bush.
Yes.
Professor Louis McCoy, like, just like the combination of teachers and that we still have, but specifically in that time at City College, like, that plays out.
Yeah.
Every other day, especially with geopolitics, that plays out every day. But within healing spaces, I see that as like the next frontier, because the word soup and the, what is this called?
Yeah, like the geopolitics.
Pop psychology on social media means that people are hearing healing and hearing ancestral veneration and hearing shadow work and cycle breaking, and people can genuinely mean it, can genuinely be about that life. But also there's people that are just picking up on that and playing into, oh, well, that's an intangible thing, but I'm gonna make it tangible by charging people $300 to sit with me for an hour. When it's like, okay, how are we commodifying spirit? Like, the push-pull there is people gotta eat. And inflation, especially here in the United States, that's the thing. So I'm like, people gotta charge what they're, what they're worthy of. Not yucking anybody's yum there. But what I am saying is that scammers are scamming, and that's a thing. And that's, this is something I talk about on Instagram all the time, around needing a part of the way that people cannot get scammed is by understanding whether
the person that they're seeking healing from in general, even us.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you ever want to work with us, do the homework on who we learned from.
Yes.
Who are our teachers? Who are we learning from, right? Like, we just talked about our undergrad teachers, right? In that regard, or that archetype. But
it's
really
when people don't cite their sources.
Either don't cite the sources,
or don't question what the sources are.
Don't question the lineage of knowledge in general with healing work, right? Which in like Ifa specifically, you cite your teachers when you pray every single time. Like, you give praise and thanks to your Baba's teacher, your this teacher. You literally peel it back, all the layers, right? So for me, I'm like, I see that in my tradition. I see that in other traditions. This plays out in certification sometimes when folks get certified in like Reiki and other things, and it's like, okay, well, who taught you, right? Like, where did you get your credentials from? And that goes back to the intangible that we keep landing back on. It's hard to certify what you can't see. Like, it's like who watches the watchman. Like, it's very much like, well, who keeps this person in their highest form? Who keeps them in integrity? Understanding that they're not always there, right? They're humans too, having a human experience. They're not always the versions, and this includes us. We're not always the Veronica and Nick that you want us to be when you come to us for whatever you come to us for, like a healing experience, some kind of event, whatever. Like, it's not always gonna be that. But I think especially like when we're thinking about healing work overall, I think that that's the way that I try to discern who I want to work with, who I want to be in community with, is literally going on, in the social media example, going to see who they follow. If they follow people, right? Because sometimes I'm like, you don't follow anybody? I'm like, okay, we're flexible.
That's a statement even of itself.
Like, you don't follow. I'm like, you don't follow anybody, but like, you're this, self. Sometimes my mom says it of like, it's not that people have to go get credentials, but sometimes and I think you said it earlier, there's sometimes a combination of events or things that have to happen to somebody for them to arrive at a certain point of like, in this scenario, wanting to be in service to other people, or wanting to be a caregiver, or wanting to be within that healing archetype. Like, that's not something that you, again, ideally, but living in the isms that we do. There's some people that roll over and decide that they're gonna give readings, like, or sometimes I come up against that when folks think that I give readings, and I'm like, no, I go get read. Yeah, right. I'm like, please don't get got by whatever Instagram scammer swiped a photo of me. I'm like, no, like, I go get read. I don't give readings, and if I do, it's to myself with some tarot cards that I need to get back to using. But like, I do that for myself. That's like, I also think that sometimes, even within like healing archetypes and people that show up in that kind of spiritual lane, I know for me, that's been a challenge with to monetize, to not monetize. Like, what do you sell that is tangible? What do you sell that is not, right? Because like, when people buy a ticket for one of my Ancestors in Training events, like, they're really just honoring my time, right? I've been told that I undercharge, but I'm also like, but if it's too high, then the people that I want to be in service to can't afford it, that defeats the purpose for me. So I've been moving into spaces of creativity where I'm like making things like this hoodie, and I gotta make one for my grandmother that's like custom for her because that's what she wants. Notebooks, or like what I'm launching with the deck, where it's like, okay, this is a tangible thing that people can hold, that holds this medicine of this project. Does that mean I want to go corporate and I want all the sponsorship and no? Because I fear and have seen a lot of people monetize their hobby, and especially the intersection of people who monetize their hobby that was holding healing spaces, and not to say hobby to diminish it, but like the people who made the leap And they did that, and shout out to them, because I'm like, I don't know if I'm that brave, but we're gonna see what 2024 has in store for me. Excuse me, I've seen them lose the joy of the thing. I've seen them lose the joy of the thing.
Yeah.
And the second that they do that, then it's like, oh, this became the only work, or like, and then fighting against the algorithm that diminishes people who are fundraising, people who are doing mutual aid work, people who are doing true blue community work on platforms that used to be designed for that, but then they're not anymore. And like understanding, like, you talked about masculinity is flat. Sometimes social media is flat.
Or it makes things.
Or it makes things super flat when it's like, no, actually this is, and you know,
it is
videos and reels and things, like it's not as flat, and you can add different dimensions to it, but even with that, it's not perfect. And I don't think any platform could be, but I think that there's ways in which you can have like a smorgasbord, if you will, of options. So it's like, okay, if you can't, this is my example. If you can't circle with me, fine. Here's the store. If you like swag, if you like merch, here you go. If you want a hoodie, here you go. If you can't circle with me, but you believe in the work, here you go. You'll be thanked in a deck that people can hold. You don't want to do either of those, but you just enjoy the community, Instagram, right? And I think that because I know the different ways in which I find healing or I find community, I try to create different pathways for people to interact with me, as opposed to saying, oh, well, if you're not donating to the deck or you're not doing this, then, you know, I don't value you. No, I actually value like everybody, because it's like, especially because I only changed. People ask me sometimes what my secret sauce is on the ancestors of training. I'm like, honestly, aside from the graphic design, because I will toot my own horn on that, I've gotten better, a lot better, super self-taught on that. But the other side of the coin is that I just took what I was already doing and shared it publicly. That's the only difference.
Your own practice.
I was sharing the questions that people get in circles and just putting it in, like, you know, the little aesthetic thing and rearranging the color palette and doing that. And that's why when folks are like, yo, like, I'm like plot twist, I was already doing that.
I think that's a huge part of the process that's lost in the commodification of healing, and the making the intangible tangible is all of this knowledge, all of this medicine, all of this wisdom that came from practice, from daily integration, daily movement of like having skin in the game, of like walking through it, you know, getting hurt, getting cut, learning, and so on and so forth, is now given in a very superficial way, where I can come across a post of yours and be like, oh, that's super deep. Oh my God, this wisdom is amazing. It's so healing. And then I just keep swiping to the next, to the next, to the next. And I don't actually practice
that's the challenge.
Thing.
Not just with our work, but like
just
healing,
in general.
Healing Instagram, or like wellness, or like witches of Instagram.
I think that there is this immediate sense of, I have this wisdom now because you gave it to me through this Instagram post, and that's it.
Right.
Now I have this wisdom. Oh my God, this is great. This, like, it's almost like I'm ingesting fast healing food,
pretty much,
and thinking that this fast food is nourishing me and healing me, when it's not.
When in actuality, it might be healing for a moment, but it's not the daily. It's not the one of the phrases that I made up for myself, or a mantra, is like, my mom, as a former teacher, always says, like, everything is an extended deliberate practice. So my amplification of that is I'm in an extended deliberate practice of myself.
Mm.
So anything that you encounter from me, for even the posts on socials, I'm like, anything that I ask online is something that I ask of myself. Other folks may not be as transparent about that. Some folks, they may post the thing, but they aren't actually practicing the thing. And that is their business.
That's a huge takeaway, though.
That is their business.
That's huge, because I think that's really it. Is like, what are you practicing on a daily basis, regardless of what, gender, race, values, whatever it is. And in the conversation that I was having with Jeff, when I asked him of like, what's in the way, what's getting in the way of men in being involved in this, and he would say their values. Yeah. They're just not committed to it. That's just everything is dictated on a person's values, and to this regard, this is something that somebody that I follow from the movement world is Ito Porto, and something that he talks a lot about in terms of the movement and like all of like physical health and all that is practice.
Yep.
That people they'll do something, but they're not practicing something.
Yeah.
They're not practicing the thing.
Mm-hmm. That's like this might be controversial. That's like people who do capoeira but don't understand the lineages of it.
Right.
That's like people,
The depth,
the depth of it, the way that it was protected and integrated into the quilombos and the history of Black people in Brazil, enough for that to be exported as a practice, right? Like that, and I'm glad life happens the way that it does, but I'm glad that I was doing capoeira with you when I was, and that was the jump off to the Orishas, like that, everything would have happened the way that it was supposed to, but like having that framework of like, oh, okay, yeah, this thing was only decriminalized within a couple of generations, if that, and like same thing with candomblé, same thing with a lot of the Orisha-based practices, right, and like there's still backlash or like a counter to, again, the intangibles and like the connections to spirit and therein, because, and for some people, capoeira is just a thing that they do, and that's fine. But even for me, as someone who like doesn't practice consistently, but like when I went to Brazil and I went to Salvador, that was the first thing I did. I was like, go to the Yamaya temple, make an offering, be like, I'll see you next year, sis. I'm sorry I wasn't here for your festival. I'll be back. And then I went and I trained in the sun, and I caught a tan through my clothes, which was the wildest thing I've ever seen in my life. I was like looking around like, what did I do? Like, oh, you were outside in your whites at like high noon. That's what you did. But I don't know why I did that to myself. Sometimes I'll like recall something like, girl, why were you? It's like doing the most and the least, it's fine. But I think that like not everybody would have gone to Brazil and had that been their like first set of steps, right? Like in the sense of the intangible of like me understanding like the different variants and the archetypes and the me's that I have been, and like, okay, that era for me was super healing because it allowed me to get back into my body after feeling like my body had been almost like dispossessed, like because of all the different isms and the things that I've survived, and like getting back into this body and that body at the time of like being like, oh, okay, like word, like this shuts off a switch in your brain, and if not, Nick is gonna yell at you and be like, get out of your head. Right? Like of like just understanding.
Veronica, you're thinking too much.
Thinking too much.
Like, I will hit you. I won't, but I will.
Like just in the look of like Veronica, I'm like, oh shit, sorry. But like being very much like that is a very whimsical example, but like that is because I value lineages. Because I value lineages broadly, but because I value lineages of knowledge, I was like, all right, if I'm in Salvador, I gotta do this, because I would not have had XYZ experience, wouldn't have did this, or I might have, but it might have taken me a whole other route if I wasn't in that moment at the time, and even understanding my nature and like how I get mad and being like, why is it that I play better when I'm angry? I don't want to be angry. Like I'm supposed to play. Like I don't keep. No, nope. The answer in me said, I'm here. Like y'all, you rang. Okay, yep. But very much like I'm very whimsical about deep inner work, which kind of can be jarring to people because I'm like kiki ha ha ha. I'm like very stereotypical Sag about things that not everybody wants to deal with or navigate.
Right. Yeah, and you need to navigate it with a little bit of lightheartedness, not taking it too seriously.
No, you can't take yourself too seriously.
And I think that is also lost in the and I guess everybody deals with through the darkness and the discomfort of the journey in their own ways. But I know for myself, the lightheartedness, the whimsicalness, the playfulness. Is an essential part of the sustainability of the practice.
Right. Because it goes back to what I was saying about like the second something isn't, like when we commodify our hobbies, it's the same thread.
Yeah.
Like,
Absolutely.
Okay, if I can't enjoy
and it's
life,
not sustainable.
Then it's not sustainable, or I can't find pleasure in the thing, I can't find joy in the thing, I can't find healing in the thing. And it's not to say that every single aspect of our lives has to be healing. I mean, ideally, that would be nice. But also we live in the times that we live in. So it's like, okay, what's perfect anyway? Miguel has a song, What's Normal Anyway? Like there's a whole spectrum of like, okay, what's normal for me is like not normal for other people.
And to that point, I wanted to ask, because you said that lineage is important to you, and obviously that is the essence of the ancestry work, and also the essence of the intangible.
Yeah.
So for someone who doesn't have or doesn't really have any idea of this, of like lineage or ancestry or the intangible, for people that are just maybe just coming into the conversation or curious and open-minded about it, what is a way that you would suggest somebody to start walking down the path of valuing or even acknowledging the reality of the intangible, the lineage?
Okay, so I would start this answer by saying that sometimes, especially for the people that you love and you care for, you're gonna want them to come along with you. They might not. Or if they do, it's gonna take them forever. Or what feels like forever to you, right? Like I'm thinking about my dad, for example, right? That whole arc of like his relationship with some of his identity and some of his family, and me being a bit of a bridge, is because I did it in spite of him not wanting to do it, right? Because I think that sometimes, I know that one of the things that I get asked, and I said it a little bit earlier, the thread of, folks wanting to do ancestral veneration work, but it like somebody in their lineage broke the chain, like it skipped a generation because of whatever bad thing happened to that person, and then our generation comes along like knock, like, so what about this, and why was this by the door, and why did we do this on New Year's, and what about, if you're that person that's like curious about those things, one of the things that you have to realize is that there should be consent in all things all the time, but that's one of the biggest ones. Like, you could ask, for example, one of the things that I always aspire for people to do is to take the prompts from social media and go find the oldest branch in their tree and ask them the same question. Like, so what do they remember about their grandparents, or what do they remember about this tradition or this thing. And like going back to my grandmother's case, she's so grateful that I do ancestors in training because she didn't have a community of people to talk about it. Like she saw ghosts and people that weren't there, and like my great grandmother was like, girl, like in 1940s Alabama didn't have the language for it, like, or it was, you know, viewed as being less than because it was intangible and it didn't have to do with the church, which is the thing. So I think if you're like my grandmother and you're reclaiming things, like being in a space as often as you can of gratitude for being the one. Like I say to folks, if there isn't somebody who was the spiritualist, was the healer, was that person, then like, surprise, you're that person. Like, welcome. This is a part of your journey. Like your descendants, chosen or otherwise, are going to know and hopefully call on you when they're navigating the challenges of their time. For folks that don't have relationships with their families and or like through circumstance or by choice, that's the same answer. Like the invitation is to be that one, to be the one that cultivates the knowledge, that does the lineage work of like doing the family tree, of like asking some of those questions and like being brave enough to be like, okay, like we're gonna do the DNA test and there's a chance that what you were told as a kid will come out as being, you know, not the whole truth, right? And like very much like, we don't want to call our ancestors liars, but depending on how we were raised and the times, it might have been safer to be, I'll speak in the I, and like some of my ancestors, like it might have been safer for them to identify as part indigenous than to acknowledge that some of their whiteness or some of their pale complexion got there because of slavery or didn't get there with consent, right? So it's like there's so many things, like even me as somebody who's very integrated and has like a lot of different integrations happening within my family, like that still comes up. I'm like, like, do we call this person a liar? Because the circumstances of their time, they made a choice that was the safest one for them, right? So when folks are navigating that, even in their identity and even who they love, I try to invite them to say that, like, especially with like, and I'm gonna zoom in on this example, homophobia and transphobia, that is a recent invention, like that, especially within spirituality, especially within ancestral traditions. There are Orishas specifically that are gender non-conforming. There are, like, even within indigenous to the Americas traditions, there are two-spirit folks who neither one gender or the other or a third, if you will. I think that if you find yourself and you're in that space, I think that as much as you can, a tangible thing to do is to archive, to journal, to write it down, to put it somewhere. So that way, not only for those that come after you, but you yourself can reflect back. Like I keep all of my old journals. Sometimes I'm like, girl, what were you doing? But most of the time I'm like, oh wow, that was really profound, or that might have been ahead of the curve. Like that's something.
The way I hear that is like to create your own, start creating your own lineage.
Yes.
Start creating your own, or start acknowledging your own intangibles.
Yeah, and if thinking about it from a tree analogy, if you're a branch and you can't pull it back to the root, then you might need to uproot yourself. You might need to plant yourself somewhere else. You might need to be the base of the tree as opposed to being a branch. Unless you're like my grandmother, who's like, no, I'm doing this because she for her design of her version of an ancestors in training hoodie, I asked her what she wanted on it, and she was like, I want a willow tree. And I was like, it's like, why a willow tree? And she was like, because I'm a branch. And I was like, okay. Very much like, all right, like you want a willow tree? Yeah, because you guys are gonna be my leaves. And I was like, but yeah, just very much like that's a again whimsical of like, I'm very much speaking to spirituality. Hello. Hello. You know, people used to worship you, you know. Yeah, people used to worship you. Yeah, I know.
I think people still do.
Well, yeah.
Well, Veronica, thank you. I really appreciate you coming through to have this conversation with me.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me. I can't wait to see all of them